Evening everyone, another video in the series, getting lots filmed this week. We're now on to paper 3 topics. So in my last video I did relationships. Today we're going to have a quick look at the aggression topic, and I'm just going to jump straight in there. We know the drill by now with explaining some of the key concepts of AO1. So if we start at the very beginning of the aggression topic, in what we have in booklet 1, which is the neural and hormonal explanations for aggression. So the first couple of booklets are very much looking at biological explanations of aggression. And the key thing to remember, particularly with the wording of the exam questions, is that if you get asked in the exam to outline or evaluate a biological explanation of aggression, that could include your knowledge of neural, hormonal or genetic, and potentially you could bring it in evolution. So there's kind of 3 or 4 different theories that would get you credit. However, if the question explicitly says neural, hormonal or genetic, then you need to make sure you know the differences between each one. So hopefully this kind of breakdown video will give you a little bit more of an insight into the common bits of knowledge that you need to know for each one. So if we start with the neural explanation of aggression, as we've looked at previously in biopsychology and the biological approach, that word neural means brain. So therefore this is looking at explanations for aggression that are specifically to do with brain structure and function, or the neurochemistry within our brain. And there's 2 parts to this theory that look at those exact concepts. So the neurochemistry explanation of aggression is linked to our good old friend serotonin. Now serotonin is a mood regulator, so having an imbalance of this neurotransmitter can always have an impact on our mood and our behaviour. In this context, we're explaining how it affects aggression. So there's a bit of a conflict in the research as to whether or not it's high or low levels of serotonin that are linked to aggression. Some studies say it's low levels, some studies say it's high levels. So the takeaway message here is that an imbalance of sorts, whether it's having too much or not enough, can have an impact on aggressive behaviour. Now, one example you can use in your AO1 here is research evidence from Cherrick, who looked at a group of male participants who had low levels of serotonin and who were acting significantly aggressively. He then treated those patients by giving them SSRIs, so drugs to increase their levels of serotonin and bring them back to normal levels, and found that when they had the drugs to increase serotonin, their levels of aggression went down. So it suggests that abnormal levels, in this particular case, low levels of serotonin, can be linked to aggression. Alternatively, if we look at brain structure, we're very much focusing on one of the key brain structures of the limbic system. Now, within the limbic system, this includes things such as the thalamus, hypothalamus, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And kind of together, they work together to focus on a range of different behaviours, and particularly we're interested here in the amygdala, because the amygdala is our emotional regulation centre, and it has been most associated in both animals and humans with the behavioural aspect of aggression. So in this part, we use the case study of Summer in our AO1. So Summer is the researcher's name, but it's quite a memorable one because the case study is about a young girl, so a young 14-year-old girl who was displaying high levels of aggressive behaviour. Now, when they did brain scans, they identified that on the amygdala, so that central part within the limbic system that's linked to emotional regulation, it had a tumour on that part of the brain. Now, it said that if we have any sort of damage or stimulation to the amygdala, that can cause us to be aggressive. So what they did with the young girl is when they gave her medication to help reduce the tumour and therefore repair the damage on her amygdala, her aggressive behaviour went right down. So again, it shows that there is that link or that correlation between damage and stimulation to that part of the brain and the behavioural characteristic of displaying aggression. So for neural explanation, you can talk about levels of serotonin or the role of the limbic system. If we compare that to hormonal, remember hormonal is still about kind of our neurochemistry, but it's more about hormones, that being things that are produced from glands within the endocrine system and target sites in the body. The main difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone is that hormones go to target sites all over. Neurotransmitters are only in the brain, hence neuro. So the particular hormone that we're interested in, as you would expect, is the role of testosterone. And all you have to say for the hormonal explanation is that high levels of testosterone are linked to high levels of aggression. To help give you a little bit more to say in your AO1, I would always use some research evidence. There's a couple of studies in the booklet that you might want to take a look at. A nice easy example is looking at Beeman. So Beeman used mice and castrated them, so kind of gave them the snip, as it were, and removed their levels of testosterone, and found that when they were castrated, their testosterone levels went down, as did their aggressive behaviour. He then re-injected the mice with testosterone and saw a significant increase in aggressive behaviour when that hormone was reintroduced. So it suggests having high or abnormal levels of testosterone can affect our behaviour significantly. If we then compare that to genetics, this is a slightly trickier aspect of the biological theories. And some of the earlier concepts in this booklet, such as the use of twin and adoption studies and looking at the role of concordance rates, is kind of straightforward and very much what we know about genetics. So the concordance rates for aggression is 19% for a DZ twin and 50% for an MZ. So those concordance rates are a little bit lower. Obviously only 50% concordance for identical twins suggests that there must be other factors, but again, that belief that the more genes you share, the higher the likelihood, that indicates that there must be something underlying and genetic here. A good way that I remember kind of the different concordance rates for aggression, I remember it as 1950, because 1950 was a couple of years after the World War, and therefore I think of war, I think of aggression. So that's just a little bit of a memory aid, or a way that I remember the concordance rates for aggression and make sure that I don't muddle them up with the ones for schizophrenia, which we'll look at in the next video. The main thing here is to focus on that particular candidate gene, which for aggression is the MAOA gene, so the monoamine oxidase A gene. And this is kind of nicknamed the warrior gene. Now, what MAOA does, it's a gene that codes for the transportation of different neurotransmitters, and it helps produce things such as serotonin. Now, what it does is it helps break these neurotransmitters down by coding for certain enzymes and proteins in order to make sure we have a balanced level of neurotransmitters. Now, everybody has an MAOA gene. Okay, I want to make that clear that the gene itself, it doesn't really affect aggression because everybody has this warrior gene. However, it's only when it's defective that it can lead to aggression. Now, there's two different ways that this gene could be defective. So what we call MAOA-H, so the H standing for high levels, so where you've got lots of the protein and it's kind of significantly breaking down serotonin at a rapid rate. Alternatively, you've got the MAOA-L gene, the L standing for low, meaning that if you have the defective L variant, you're not breaking down enough serotonin, which means that we end up having a surplus of serotonin in the brain because that gene's not working properly to break it all down. And as we identified in previous research from the neural explanation, having too much serotonin can lead to aggression. So out of these defective genes, it's only been identified that the MAOA-L variant is the one that tends to be linked to aggression. So L meaning low level of enzymes, not enough serotonin being broken down, meaning it ends up having high levels which link to aggressive behaviour. In terms of the gene itself, I would just focus on making sure that you know the L variant and you can explain how that affects the behaviour. But that's essentially, if you know the concordance rates, you know how the gene works, and then that's the essential aspect to know for the genetic components. If we move on a little bit, still in the biological kind of realm, but to more kind of evolutionary and ethological theories, booklet 3 is ethological explanations. Now, if we remember back to the attachment video, I said that word ethology is about studying animals in their natural habitat and using animal studies, so for example, an attachment like Lorenz and Harlow, to try and understand human behaviour. And this is often quite useful if what we're studying is quite socially sensitive, or we want to study something where the use of humans would be inappropriate. So the ethological explanation of aggression looks at animals and kind of focuses on two key concepts to explain how and why animals are aggressive, and then try to apply that to the human species. Now, the two key concepts or terms that you need to know for this booklet are fixed action patterns and innate releasing mechanisms. They're both named on the spec, meaning you could get a direct question about those key terms and concepts. So if we start with an innate releasing mechanism, if we break that word down, the word innate means something that's natural, that's hardwired, that we are born with. Okay, it serves an evolutionary purpose. A releasing, well, if you're releasing something, you're letting it go, it's in response to something, like releasing a hormone, releasing a neurotransmitter. And a mechanism is, again, a little bit like a model or a structure or something that's, again, embedded within us and it serves a purpose. A bit like a defence mechanism, serves the purpose of protecting us. So if we think about that word innate releasing mechanism in the context of aggression, there are 3 bullet points that from the exam specification you have to include in your answer in order to get the marks. So the first key thing you would need to include if you were describing an innate releasing mechanism is that it is a hardwired brain network. Use that exact language, hardwired brain network. So this is something that is ingrained within you. It then is a response to a specific sign stimulus. So there is something in the environment that when we see it, that hardwired brain network kicks in and we have like an automatic response. And the third bullet point is therefore that initiates a set sequence of behaviours. Obviously in this context we're focusing on aggression, but innate releasing mechanisms can be in relation to other behaviours. So a really good example of this is when bulls see that red rag and the movement of the red rag, they have this innate hardwired brain network that in response to the sign stimulus of the red moving rag, they act aggressively. Now the example that you would use in the exam would be in relation to Tinbergen's study. So Tinbergen's study was the one with the fish, the sticklebacks with the different coloured underbellies, and they looked at, particularly in this breed of fish, that all of the males had this red underbelly, so this kind of red spot underneath that indicated that they were male. Now, the other stickleback fish, if they saw a male, they had this innate releasing mechanism with this kind of automated response of acting aggressively towards the other males, because the other male is perceived as a threat in terms of their ability to survive and reproduce. So males kind of are innately hardwired to attack each other in order to protect their own resources and improve their chances of finding a mate. And so what Tinbergen did in his study is he identified that if he put a stickleback fish in a tank with different models of stickleback, so different wooden shapes that range from a very realistic model all the way to a very unrealistic model. It didn't matter how realistic the model was and how much it looked like a fish. What was more important was whether or not it had that sign stimulus of the red underbelly. And every single male stickleback, when they saw that red underbelly, they reacted with aggression. Which takes me on to the next key term, being fixed action pattern. Now, all that means is that the behaviour is universal, so that every person or every animal within the same species acts in the exact same way. So thinking about Tinbergen's study, the fact that every single stickleback fish responded to the models in the same way suggests that this pattern is fixed within the entire species. It has that universality. So a little bit of an acronym to help you remember the concepts for ethology is USA-BUS. USA-BUS standing for universal, sign stimulus, adaptive, so the idea that this is for survival purposes. You've got the B standing for ballistic, so this is the idea that it's inevitable. Once we start this process, it can't be stopped. We can't reverse the process of that, in this case, aggressive behaviour being displayed. The second U stands for unlearnt, so the idea that we can't, again, unlearn the behaviour. It is very much innate and ingrained within us. And then the last S being stereotyped, the idea that there are very common stereotype behaviours that are very predictable for certain kind of species. The key things from that I would take away is, if you know innate releasing mechanisms and fixed action patterns, and the fact that they're universal and that they're for survival purposes, you're golden. So speaking of survival, we go on to booklet 4, which is the evolutionary explanation. Now, this has some similar concepts in, except this is purely referring to human aggression, human behaviour, and the survival instincts of us as a human species. So similarly, it talks about it being about survival, about provision of resources. So for example, we might be aggressive in terms of evolution because we want to gain status in society. We want to show dominance. We want to protect our resources that we have. Alternatively, we also want to increase our reproductive success and minimise things such as cuckoldry. So cuckoldry is a result of sexual jealousy. So sexual jealousy occurs often when we feel threatened by members of the same sex, and how that affects our access to members of the opposite sex. So if there's anything that's in the way of you successfully reproducing with a partner, that is sexual jealousy. And this is something that researchers identified typically as something that only males will display and can lead to aggressive behaviours. And the reason for sexual jealousy is because we want to avoid, as I said, cuckoldry. Now, that term cuckoldry is about fathering another man's child unknowingly. So we don't want to, as an individual, risk bringing up somebody else's child because evolutionary, or in an evolutionary sense, that doesn't serve a purpose for you in terms of being able to reproduce, to pass on your genes. It's not seen as advantageous for you as an individual. So the evolutionary explanation, which again, as we know from relationships, is very old school, purely focused on reproduction and survival, would say that we are aggressive in a way that helps us protect our partner or protect our provision of resources, whether that be something physical like money and status, or whether that be an actual partner. Now, the way that we would do this is through what we call a mate retention tactic. Now, a mate retention tactic is a technique often that people, again, predominantly males, would use towards a partner in order to keep them and prevent them having access to other people. But these mate retention tactics, whilst they might not be physically aggressive, they could lead to aggression or have aggression kind of intentions underlying. So the first mate retention tactic is known as direct guarding. So this is about you physically preventing access from other people to your partner. So you are directly guarding them. So that could be things such as not letting them see certain friends, monitoring where they're going, checking their phone, trying to prevent them from having opportunities to speak to other people, so that you're trying to minimise that threat. So this could be either through physical aggression, kind of threatening potential suitors and potential partners that try to speak to your your other half, or it could be just not letting them go out, not letting them see other people, and physically guarding what they see as their resource. Whereas a negative inducement is about kind of more of that emotional aggression, that manipulation, coercive behaviour, in terms of being so negative towards your partner that you make them feel that they are not worthy of speaking to somebody else, and therefore they don't leave, more so out of fear, or because they feel that they don't deserve to have other friendships and connections. So that could be something physical, in terms of domestic violence, or that it tends to be more verbal, and more things such as if you do this, I'm going to do this, that kind of very manipulative, gaslighting type behaviour. It might be calling them names such as fat or ugly, and kind of making them have a negative impact on their body image and kind of how they perceive themselves. So evolutionary aggression is all about survival and reproduction, how by being aggressive we increase our chances of survival because we show dominance and we can gain status and money, and by having, for example, a higher paid job through being really overconfident and aggressive, either physically or verbally. Or it's about negatively treating our partner as a means of warning off other potential people, to kind of prevent them from possibly leaving you. Booklet 5 is quite a large booklet, and this is where we start to move away from those earlier biological examples and onto what we call social psychological explanations. Now, social psychological explanations hasn't come up in a little while on the papers, so make sure you are checking those question predictions and kind of planning for all of the eventual essays. But there's 3 main theories in this booklet, and therefore there's enough information that you could get a 16 marker on just one of these 3, or you often get an essay that asks you to combine or talk about multiple social psychological theories. So I'm going to talk through them all individually. And again, they are all named on the spec, so you do need to know these theories by name and be really familiar with these concepts. So the first one is the frustration aggression hypotheses. And this is all kind of focused around this belief that in order to be aggressive, it's a result of feeling frustrated. Now, frustration is a feeling that is built up because of our ability or lack of ability to achieve a goal. So when we are close to achieving a goal, if something prevents us from achieving that goal, we feel frustrated. And as a consequence, we act aggressively. So this believes that everybody has these innate drives, so very kind of a psychodynamic type theory, these innate and unconscious drives to act aggressively as a means of relieving that frustration. It's a kind of very cathartic way of looking at things, of kind of releasing that anger. Now, one thing that affects whether or not we are likely to be aggressive is the proximity to the goal. So I always use the example of, if I'm stuck in traffic, for example, if I'm stuck in traffic on the roundabout right by college and I'm so close and I can see my destination at the end, and I'm stuck in standstill, because I'm close to my destination, I'm more likely to get frustrated and angry compared to if I'm stuck in traffic 5 minutes away from my house because I've got ages to drive until I get to college, I'm not quite close to my goal. Or if you were queuing for something, if somebody pushed in front of you in the queue, but you were 200 people in front of you and you're right at the back of the queue, you probably would think, what's one extra person? But if you've spent hours and hours queuing in line all day and you're right by the front and somebody pushed in, because you're closer to achieving your goal, you would be more frustrated and therefore more angry. Now, the key bit of AO1 for frustration, so you would explain what it is, like I've just done with an example. The key bit here is to use Green's puzzle study. So Dollard came up with the concept of frustration aggression, but it was Green who identified the key study about the puzzle. So this is the one with the impossible puzzle, the condition where participants get interrupted doing a puzzle, or where they get insulted. And then across the 3 different groups, they are then given a task where they are able to display aggression towards other people, and they found that the condition that had the highest level of frustration were the ones that were most aggressive. So I'm not going to go into that study in detail because I'm conscious we've got a lot to recap still. But I would make sure you are confident with Green's puzzle study because it's really good expansion of knowledge in your AO1, and it gives you more to say, because without that study there's not too much you can comment on for frustration and aggression. So if it was a 16 marker, I would definitely want to see that research study within your knowledge. Next, you've got social learning theory. So this is quite an easy one because it's building on what you already know from the approaches topic. Just make sure you explicitly link this to social learning theory. To aggression. So obviously social learning theory is about learning through observation and imitation of role models. If we identify with a role model, that's more likely to occur. This concept of vicarious reinforcement and modelling and mediational processes. So the idea that we pay attention, if we then can retain the information, so we remember in this case, the aggressive act. Reproduction. So this is about your ability to physically reproduce the behaviour. And M, the motivation, and that's about that vicarious reinforcement. What is encouraging you to observe and then imitate that behaviour? So I would talk about the process of ARM, to talk about the mediational processes, but use an example that is linked to aggression. So for example, watching somebody punch somebody else, you would have to pay attention. You would then remember the way in which that person was punched. Because punching is an easy, replicable behaviour and you have the physical skills to do it, in comparison to, say, a double spinning roundhouse kick, unless you've got the skills, in which case, so do I, congratulations. But if you don't have that physical skill and knowledge of martial arts, then you would struggle to do that. And then the motivation, well, if the person you saw having a fight with somebody was rewarded by praise, this is really common, for example, if people are watching things in the media, like playing a game where you get points for the fight, or it's a superhero and therefore that they get all this praise and adoration from other people, that acts as a motivating factor. I would say the easiest way to ensure that you are linking this explicitly to aggression is to use Bandura's Bobo doll study. You can either talk about this in AO1 or as one of your evaluation points as evidence to support, but the study itself is about modelling aggressive behaviour. The children being aggressive to the Bobo doll. So it's a really good and kind of essential bit of knowledge that I would expect to see in that essay, especially if it's a 16 marker. The last social psychological explanation is looking at the role of de-individuation. Now, de-individuation is about having anonymity. So when we are anonymous, often by for example, wearing a mask or having our identity hidden or taken away, if we are in some way anonymous, we are more likely to engage in socialised aggressive behaviour. And Le Bon suggested this is because of a collective mindset. So more so when we are in a social situation or with large groups of people. So you often see this, for example, at big football matches or concerts and events where you're with a large group of people, you're not very easily identifiable. You start to have this collective mindset where you become aggressive as a group because you don't see the consequences of your actions and you feel that you are acting kind of as one, as a group collective, rather than you as an individual. And that when you are displaying that kind of de-individuated behaviour, there is a shift in your self-awareness. So Prentice Dunn suggested that we have what we call our public self-awareness, so how you think you are in public and how you choose to present yourself in society when around others. And then you've got your private self-awareness. So that's about your internal morals and standards and kind of what you believe is correct. But when we are de-individuated, it suggested there is a shift or a change in your public and private self-awareness, and therefore you are more likely to act aggressively because you no longer kind of feel responsible for your actions. You feel, well, no one's going to know it's me, so you don't really think as deeply into how you're behaving, and you tend to act in a more aggressive manner. So a really good study to use, particularly in the evaluation for this, is Zimbardo. So you can talk about the Stanford prison experiment and how by him wearing the mirror, by all of the guards wearing the uniform and the mirrored sunglasses, they kind of were de-individuated and started acting collectively aggressive as a group. Zimbardo also did some replications of Milgram's electric shock experiment, but where the participants were wearing kind of masks or hoods, so their face couldn't be seen. And again, that level of anonymity further increased their levels of destructive obedience, and they kind of went much higher in the shock voltage much quicker because of that kind of lack of identity. Now, booklet 6 and 7 are kind of looking at aggression rather than as a whole. It starts to investigate aggression in a very specific manner, okay, in a very detailed setting. So, for example, booklet 6 is called institutional aggression. So when we think of that concept of an institution is in this case a prison. Okay, so we've heard that word institutionalization before in attachment with reference to orphanages and care facilities. Sometimes you might refer to a school as an institution or a business as an institution. But in this context, we're looking at aggression in prisons. Now, in particular, we're not looking at the reason why people go to prison, and that's a whole different theory. So we're not looking at the reasons for crime and incarceration. We are looking at, in this booklet, when people come to prison, why are they aggressive in prison? So when there's fights and disputes and riots within a prison amongst prisoners, what are the reasons that they continue to be aggressive even after they've been incarcerated? And there's two main kind of theories or beliefs for this that break down into those key terms of dispositional and situational. So remember, situational explanation is one that refers to the situation, so to the people around you, to environmental factors in society, whereas dispositional explanations refer to your personal disposition, to your personality trait and your internal kind of factors and life experiences. So in the context of institutional aggression, the dispositional explanation is called the importation model. Now, the importation model of aggression is referring to what do prisoners bring into the prison setting with them from their previous life and experience. So this can be things such as their biology, any social psychological explanations like aggressive role models that they've learned behaviour from in the past, things like societal factors like gang culture, any sort of substance abuse, trauma, all of these kind of individual differences and personal reasons why somebody might be aggressive. It's looking at what are those possible factors, and it's the belief that because of the person you are before you get to prison, you import and therefore bring in those factors to the prison setting. So if you're aggressive in prison, it's not because of the prison itself, it's because of you as an individual and the factors and the experiences and the personality traits you bring with you when you get arrested. Whereas the situational explanation for institutional aggression is called the deprivation model. Now, Sykes suggested that this is about the prison setting, and the things that when you become a prisoner, what are the things you were deprived of? What are the things that you have to give up as a means of being punished and spending time in an institution? And he broke it down into 5 key areas of deprivation, and we use the acronym of SHLAG to help us remember this one. So it starts off with deprivation of security. This is about a prisoner's lack of feeling safe. You know, particularly if you are in a high security prison or if you're in a cell next to people that have committed more significant and dangerous crimes, you might not feel particularly safe in that area. You've been stripped of that right and that deprivation of safety. So because of that deprivation, you might act aggressively in prison as a means of protecting yourself or to kind of build up a reputation so people leave you alone and you feel more safe. Next, you've got deprivation of heterosexual relationships. So for the majority of prison life, it is all very much segregated into biological sex, so kind of males and females. So if you identify in a way where you would want a heterosexual relationship, that can't happen in a normal prison setting because you don't have access to the opposite sex. So your kind of natural innate drive to want to be in a relationship or want to be intimate with somebody, that's taken away and you don't have the opportunity to explore that, which also explains why a lot of people then turn to homosexual relationships or encounters in prison, because that's the only option that they have to form a connection or have intimacy with somebody, and it's better to explore and to try what you typically would say you prefer than not to have that at all. So often people might become aggressive because they are frustrated at their lack of opportunity to have sex or relationships with people of the opposite sex the way they maybe would normally on the outside. Next, you've got deprivation of liberty. So this is about freedom, the idea that you can't do what you want, you can't go certain places, you can't leave the prison facilities, you can't go anywhere without some sort of restriction or supervision. So it's that lack of feeling of freedom, which feeds into the A in the acronym, which is deprivation of autonomy. This is about your ability to make choices being taken away from you. So even things like meal times, exercise breaks, shower times, all of those kind of key decisions that we take for granted and we normally make in everyday life, like when we want to eat, when we want to wash, when we want to go to bed, they are all very much policed and routines and kind of very strictly monitored. So there feels like there's a lack of individuality and control in your behaviour in a prison setting. And then finally, you've got deprivation of goods and services. So this is about your access to kind of materialistic things. So things like cigarettes, alcohol, chocolate, video games, just kind of trivial items that normally would give us a lot of pleasure. But when there is a limit or a restriction on certain items in terms of what you can and can't have and or how much you're allowed to have, that builds up a significant level of frustration. And as a result, as we looked at in the frustration aggression hypotheses, frustration leads to aggressive behaviour. It's a consequence of that feeling of not being able to achieve your goal, which in this case would be having that good or service or that freedom or that relationship. And then lastly, we look at media influences. Now, this is quite a tricky booklet because it's a small part of the spec, but essay questions could come up in this area, and there's really specific key terminology that you need to know. So the phrasing on the specification is research into the influence of computer and video games, including the role of disinhibition, desensitization, and cognitive priming. And we've included kind of both AO1 and AO3 points for all of those concepts. So I would look back at the media booklet and PowerPoints, kind of refresh your memory of some of the evaluations. So if you get a smaller AO3 question and like evaluating some of these concepts specifically, you have a few really kind of key points in your head that you know you could include. So remember that word research means studies and or theories. But for the first part, we kind of have given you 3 studies in the booklet that really clearly show the role of media influence. Now, if the phrase is media influence in the question, you can talk about any type of media, computer and video games, TV, film, social media. You can kind of talk about media as a whole outlet. However, if the question says computer/video games, then obviously you have to specifically refer to that in your example. So just look really carefully. Does it say media influence or explicitly computer and video games? If it was a 16 marker on media influence, I would talk about some of the studies into computer and video games and cognitive priming, disinhibition, desensitization. I'd include a little bit of everything in there, so you've got a much broader knowledge and kind of showing that breadth versus depth, whereas the short answer questions might be more prescriptive. So again, there is a conflict in the research. Some studies suggest that playing computer and video games is actually very good at decreasing aggression because it's very cathartic, whereas other studies suggest it significantly increases aggression. So there's two studies kind of for and one against. The two studies for aggression in terms of the media negatively affecting it come from Matthews and Carnegie. So Carnegie did a study where people played either a violent video game or a non-violent video game for 20 minutes. They then during which they had their heart rate and physiological kind of galvic skin responses monitored, and they then played that for 20 minutes. They then watched a video of real life violence for 20 minutes and again had the same heart rate, skin responses, everything taken. And they found that the people that had been exposed previously to a violent game had lower physical responses and less of a dramatic reaction when being exposed to watching real life violence. And it was said that they had become desensitized to that, and therefore they were used to kind of seeing that violent behaviour, and therefore physically, in terms of our kind of stress and anxiety levels, they were much lower. We didn't have a big reaction to it. Matthews also did a study looking at the role of the amygdala, which, as we previously looked at in the neural explanation, is the part of the brain linked to aggression in terms of emotional regulation and response. And through brain scanning studies found that when people had been playing the violent video games versus non-violent, there was more activity in the amygdala whilst playing those games, suggesting that those games are stimulating the part of the brain linked to aggression and increasing those aggressive levels. So there's a correlation between your brain structure and exposure to violent media. Whereas Kestenbaum and Weinstein, again, don't worry too much about these names, they're not on the spec, so if you can't remember, just say researchers found. But Kestenbaum and Weinstein said actually, when they used self-report techniques to interview young males who had played violent video games, a lot of the boys actually reported that by playing the violent video games, it had a very cathartic releasing effect on them. So they got all of their anger out in the game and it made them feel better if they were feeling maybe a bit stressed or frustrated. Meaning that when they finished playing the game and put the controller down or walked away from the computer, they felt fine, they felt relaxed, and they were less likely to display aggressive behaviour in the real world because they got it all out in the game and therefore they didn't feel the need to act upon that feeling of frustration. So that suggested actually computer and video games have a positive effect on aggression and actually reduce it rather than increase it. So you've got a couple of studies there you could talk about if you were debating the influence of the computer games. In terms of these key concepts, I've briefly mentioned desensitization. So this is the belief that by having continual exposure to something, you become more used to it and therefore are less physically bothered. And if you're less physically bothered by that behaviour, for example, you don't find it as upsetting or as shocking and distressing, then you would be more likely potentially to behave that way in the real world because you don't see it as a problem, you don't recognise the severity of that behaviour because you've become overexposed to it and don't really see it maybe as much as a bad thing. So it increases the risk of aggressive behaviour. Disinhibition is about an individual's kind of lack of responsibility and kind of disassociation between what you're doing and the consequences that it poses. So a really good example for this one is particularly when you're online gaming. So disinhibition actually is only relevant to kind of online media because this links to our sense of anonymity. So when we are de-individuated, again, linking some concepts to previous content. But when we're de-individuated online, so when you're playing online, no one can see that it's you. You could have, if you really wanted to, a different image, a fake username. Like it's very hard to identify who the people are online. People can often pretend to be other people, and it's a lot more difficult to track down compared to if you were playing with someone or talking to somebody face to face. So those interactions are a lot more anonymised and they're also a lot less policed. So we tended to find in research that when people are playing online games, people often reported having lots of aggressive and kind of verbal violence towards them, including derogatory and racist or aggressive comments, because of that sense of anonymity, because it's a lot more difficult for that behaviour to be called out online compared to if you were to say that to somebody or act that way to somebody in the real world. Well, it's a hate crime, so you would most likely be arrested and there would be consequences. So people become disinhibited and are more likely to engage in this behaviour because of that lack of consequence and kind of minimising that potential negative outcome. And so online, it's more likely that you would display certain aggressive behaviours that you definitely wouldn't in the real world. And finally, the concept of cognitive priming. So the key thing to remember with cognitive priming is that, yes, it's about modelling, but it's not about direct observation and imitation. So the key thing here is not to get muddled between cognitive priming and social learning theory. Okay, it's two separate concepts. So cognitive priming is when we are exposed to media, so when we watch something or read something or we see something happening in a media outlet and we memorise that aggressive behaviour and we create almost like a script or a schema in our head, and then when you are exposed to that similar situation in the real world, you act accordingly by kind of copying that aggressive response. So a really good example to give you is if I was watching kind of trashy TV, something maybe like Geordie Shore, for example, and I saw somebody get swilled and throw a drink in somebody's face, if I was watching that, cognitive priming would be me remembering that in response to an argument, that action of having a drink thrown in your face, me memorising that and kind of storing that. And then if I got into an altercation with somebody and I threw a drink in their face, that wouldn't be a direct observation because it's not immediate. I'm not immediately watching and copying. I've memorised that response of aggression to a certain situation from when I saw it in the media, and then now I'm in that same situation as what I've witnessed in the media. I'm responding in a similar way. So the key thing for cognitive priming, it's about memorising aggressive behaviour that's been witnessed, creating scripts or schemas, and then using that knowledge to react accordingly when you are in a similar situation. So it's not direct observation and imitation, it's about creating a kind of script in your own mind that you might then utilise in situations based on what you have seen from the media. Again, make sure you link it back to media continuously. If in doubt, use the example of kind of video and computer games for media, because that is obviously listed as one of the examples on the spec. So there's your whistle-stop tour of the aggression topic. I'll be doing a similar video this week for schizophrenia. As always, if you've got any comments, comment down below, or get yourself over to the Instagram page for some of the live Q&As and kind of the drop-in sessions with your teachers all this week. But yeah, hopefully that's been useful and kind of picked out just some of the key facts, researchers' names, and essential points that you need to know for aggression. So make sure you take the time to go over it. You are very close to achieving that goal of doing the paper, so try not to let anything frustrate you.